that's coming.
I'm sorry, did you ask me to?
Yeah, would you like to?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Father in heaven, we thank you so much for bringing us all together to for this presentation. We thank you for all the blessings that you've given us this day, the strength that you've given us to walk through and be here today. We pray that you will bless our presenter, Robert, and I pray that you will help us to all be alert and pay attention and understand the words that you are teaching us through him. We pray that we will all be willing to accept all the truths that you're giving us and let go of any of our preconceived notions. Be willing to give ourselves completely over to you. And we just thank you so much for your love and your mercy and your grace. And we pray all this in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. And you got share screen on your end, right, Robert?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just pray that there's no interruptions on this end. It's pretty crazy around here right now.
Oh boy.
Can you see it?
Yeah, it's up.
Okay. All right, this is by test. It happened on February last year, 2020. It's called Revolutions and Good Advice. Just to remind us what we were doing over the last days, we went through that dream of Ellen White, which takes us through a reform line. We overlaid it with our own reform lines as priests. This small group that's cut out of this larger group, the stone out of this mountain, and then tracing their journey along this narrowing path. The journey gets more and more difficult. At 9/11, we see cords descend. In these cords is what they must hold onto for a balance and security, but still they have earth beneath their feet. They must systematically let go of all of the baggage that they tried to bring with them, all the way down to their shoes and to their stockings. As they go barefoot, their feet start to bleed. Towards the latter rain Sunday law time period, that path starts to hurt. Ellen White speaks about seeing the blood of those who have gone before, the blood from their feet, and yet still they made it. Then we come to the chasm. This chasm is marking Gethsemane, the cross, the beginning of the time of trouble. They have all of a sudden this question, what are these cords attached? For the previous dispensation in the history of the latter rain, there is just enthusiasm. They shout, we have hold from above. They don't need to question what those cords are attached to. But now in the time of trouble, when they must let go of all the pathway, when they must wrap their arms around these cords and trust only in those cords, now comes a question. But what are the cords attached to? So we've been trying to review the cords that we were given, just a few of them. We know we are in Jacob's time of trouble. Elder Parmender has spoken exclusively about Jacob's time of trouble in the previous months. Why does Jacob hurt? Because he's fighting the angel. He has held on to the same sin that he had before, and because he's held on to that sin, and his angel has come to convince him of that, he sees this angel as an enemy, and that had begun the fight. In fact, the fact that he is fighting against the angel, that makes this his time of trouble. He should not have been fighting against the work of the angel. That lines up with the experience of the disciples after the cross, still holding on to the sin that they were meant to have put away. Then we place the two dispensations that we are in from the history of the time in the 40 days after the cross. and the 40 days after baptism. Those 40 days tell the experience of this movement from the close of probation to that increase of knowledge. From 2019, close of probation, to when we receive the increase of knowledge. We remind ourselves of Acts 20, verse 7. We are still in the history when the Sunday law is opening up. It's far from being completed. Then we began to look at one of these lines, the chief line we take from the Millerite history. We are after October 22, 1844. So I want to finish this discussion on revolutions, and then I want us to look at our key reform lines, the end of ancient Israel and the beginning of modern Israel. So we've been discussing revolutions. We showed how we came to the study of revolutions. This study gave us this pattern, a revolution from 9/11 to 2019, with a midpoint in 2014, where you see one side began to have victory over the other. It's a turning point. 2014, the turning point. November 9, 2019 marks the end of that revolution. (2020) marks the beginning of the counter-revolution and the dictatorship established by this revolution. The establishment of the United States is overthrown through a revolution from 9/11 to 2019. In 2020, counter-revolution begins against this new leadership. We discussed why 9/11 would mark the beginning of a revolution. It's this political polarization that has occurred within the United States, this divide between Democrats and Republicans, but particularly centered on the beginning of the Iraq War. We referenced a number of articles and a YouTube video, and we discussed that, and I will just read one sentence from that as revision. The degree of bastardization over Iraq, and with the role of partisanism, media outlets like Fox News and driving it may have marked the dawn of a new normal. So, over the centuries, polarization occurs, but usually after there's a tense issue that they can come back to some type of agreement. There can be some semblance of normal. What happened with the rise of the 24-hour cable news networks? Beyond Fox, just that system in general was a sensationalizing of news that turned it from something that was to educate us into something that was more to entertain us. It made news to be sensational. So it's the whole package, the whole system of how news is spread, how that has done. News is spread now that has done, but Fox News has been something special. They've taken that sensationalism, that 24-hour news cycle that is entertainment, and turned it into something that is a propaganda machine for the right wing, particularly Protestant Christians, white nationalistic right wing of the United States. Once that happened, it was the dawn of a new normal. You cannot come back to a place of agreement with the other side. This flick can only continue to grow. This occurred from 9/11 through the Bush administration, particularly enhanced by the Iraq War. A turning point occurred in 2014, where one side of this equation began to win. And we mentioned the three things that happened in 2014. It was the beginning of the work begun by Jeff Sessions, Steve Bannon, and Stephen Miller to purge the Republican Party from the inside. Mitch McConnell started to block Obama's appointments to the judicial branch. This was a taking over of that branch of the U.S. government by right-wing conservatives. And three, I wanted us to have marked the Supreme Court case, Brunwell versus Hobby Lobby, which led, according to Americans United for Separation of Church and State, it opened a door that could lead to a dangerous, wry interpretation of the meaning of a religious freedom. It was part of that opening door, and it has done that. I think right interpretation, that means just a soft interpretation, or I believe. So leaving behind 9/11, 2014 as a turning point, 2019, end of the revolution. Okay. We discussed what November 9 was. When we looked at the lines that built up that day, we stepped back and considered Raffia. I have for many months now asked people to question why they call that waymark Raffia. It's as if that name Raffia has its trumped every other name you might call that waymark. It just is Raffia, and I wanted us to question that because Raffia is one single aspect of a more complex waymark. I wanted us to question how we looked at waymarks. Why do we say 1989, 9/11? Why do we go from years to day and when it suits us, and then from days back to years when that suits us? We have been not precise in how we have handled the waymarks, and that's part of the confusion over 2019. So the last year we reinforced the point. Watch the external events occurring throughout the year. They particularly started in earnest in March. March being their overthrow of the ISIS caliphate. March being Venezuela, Russian troops in Venezuela. There was this particular intensity that escalated in March that took us through the whole of 2019 in a similar way to what happened in 2014. But then there is also how we described it as Raffia that can be misleading if we're not precise with our terms. So November 9, this date did not come to by the study of time span that took us to 2019. For example, impeachment. Impeachment never takes us to November 9. It only takes us to the year 2019. In 1868, Andrew Johnson is impeached. It's a process throughout 1868. He does not get impeached on November 9. So when we make the application of that, Donald Trump was never expected to be impeached on November 9. What did take us to the day was the study on revolutions. The study on revolutions we discussed is what front in World War III. World War I and World War II have two fronts, Eastern Front, Russia versus the United States, and a Western Front, United States versus the West, United States versus the United States. We all agree, as far as those who are willing to participate in the comments, that the study of revolutions is internal. It is civil war, which is United States against United States, and it's a Western Front. Once we had all agreed it was a Western Front, we went back to November 9, 1989, and we reminded ourselves how that is described in Daniel 11, verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. That's Daniel 11:40. This is a battle in 1989 between the Soviet Union and the king of the south, and the United States, which is Eastern Front. But then we discussed why you would describe 1989 that way. The reason that the Soviet Union fell was because of internal civil unrest. It was civil war from the inside. You don't see the United States. But one of the reasons you have unrest on the inside is because of the work of the United States. So even this unrest that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall was a result of the actions of the King of the North. So the Civil War, this internal struggle, can still be described as Eastern Front. It was really brought on by this conflict between the two superpowers. So when we come to November 9, is it Eastern Front or is it Western? It's both. It's Eastern because who sparked the civil unrest? Russia. It's Western because all you're going to see is internal issues inside America relating to America. There is a strong connection between what happened in 1989 and what Vladimir Putin did in South America. Does anybody remember what he did in South America? I'm not sure. You'll remember we discussed Libya. Libya before 2011, it was a sphere of influence of Russia. Gaddafi was a Russian puppet, if I can put it so black and white. When the CIA had him overthrown and killed, Vladimir Putin lost his sphere of influence. That happened in 2011. In 2011, he watches Arab Spring arise. Arab Spring is hitting many other countries that are also in his sphere of influence. It started hitting Syria, for example. And then you have what is also called the snow revolutions. In 2011, Vladimir Putin announces he's making a return as president, and tens of thousands of Russian people take to the streets in protest. So you have all of these events in 2011 that makes Vladimir Putin very angry against the United States. And what does he decide to do? He's going to do to the United States the exact same thing he believes the United States did to the Soviet Union and is doing to him. The United States conducts regime change from the inside. The United States sends in the CIA and overthrows rulers from the inside. He believes the United States was behind the protests in his own country. He believes that they were behind what happened in Ukraine throughout those years. And that's probably part of why he's all the cyber attacks on the oil line and now the meat markets and he's trying to disrupt from the inside of America.
Agreed.
Yeah.
That's what's going on.
Yep. So his response from 2011 to 2014 is to set up Russia. Over a few years, he sets up the Internet Research Agency and begins building up, recruiting people to start doing to America what he believed America did to him at the end of the Cold War. He physically watched the fall of the Soviet Union, so he's going to do to America what America did to him, interfere from the inside is exactly what he's doing. Looking at 1989, he blamed the United States. He knew that the civil unrest was a result of the Cold War, and he's taken those tactics and that is what he has done against the United States in the last 8 or 9 years. So these two dates, that is what's happening in America. What happens inside the Soviet Union in 1989 also has a direct link. But the Battle of Raffia itself was not something internal that happened in the Seleucid Empire or the Ptolemaic Empire. It was civil unrest in those countries. It was a fight over Coal Syria, that middle strategic piece of land that they were fighting over. They're still fighting over it. So when we talk about Raffia and we're waiting for November 9th for Raffia, that's where we would start to get into trouble. Raffia was a fight over spheres of influence. It's not limited to one territory like it was when the world was small. Ptolemy and Seleucus were never going to fight over Venezuela, but I don't know how it exists. Now this battle is worldwide, and we discussed yesterday this Raffia, this fight over spheres of influence. You have Libya, Yemen, Syria, Venezuela, and there are others like Ukraine. Those are some of the key ones that we discussed. And when we looked at just why they are so strategically important, some people have asked about this date at the end of the counter-revolution, the date for the end of the counter-revolution. So I'm going to take us back to the Western Front of this part of that story. It's discussing this Western Front. When does the Western Front end? In World War II. The Western Front ends at the same point that the Eastern Front does. And when does the Eastern Front end? It ends in 2021 at Panium. It is an ending, but remember, this is a deadly wound. The conflict continues all the way to the Sunday Law. But the deadly wound is struck here at Panium. So there will not be so suddenly an end of polarization and the end of all these issues, but it is the deadly wound. That pathway is set in concrete. So then we'll do this fast 2020, where we are now, the counter-revolution. This is why I wanted us to study these revolutions, is to bring us back to 2020. So I'm not sure how we view 1991. I'm not sure if we believe that the increase of knowledge in 1991 happened on the exact same day that the Soviet Union crumbled. I would suggest that it did not. I'm not sure how much people are aware of the external events of 2009, that waymark of Concord. Whether or not they believe those events happened on the exact same day as Parmender was presenting the 2520 series in Arkansas, I would suggest that they did not. One that I can speak about more clearly is 2016. 2016 is conquered, and you can mark it by a day. It's the victory of Donald Trump in that election in the Sunday Law history. When was conquered? Just a reminder. When was conquered? Just a reminder. Boston conquered Exeter, October 22. This waymark of Concord, the external event. What's the external event in 2016? It's November 8 and 9, 2016, that election of Donald Trump. So did Acts 27, Acts 20, verse 7, open up on November 8 and November 9? No, there isn't a day-to-day correlation between a sudden opening up of that message and the external event, but it happened in that time period. It happened in the latter months of 2016. So what I want to mark is the internal increase of knowledge when it becomes visible either to an individual or to the movement. The movement doesn't know until 2 years later, just to remind us. But it actually doesn't become visible to anyone on the same day. What happens is something that occurs within that time frame in the history of Concord externally. You have an increase of knowledge. So when it comes to 2020 and we have our increase of knowledge, this is a time period internally, but it is also a day externally. What I want to briefly discuss is the day. It's easy to see that November 8 and 9, 2016 mark Concord. What were we expecting to see in 2020? One more revolution that we haven't particularly discussed, and that is the American Revolution. And what What is 2020 in an American Revolution? It's the Battle of Concord and Lexington. So we know that this waymark is Concord. This one here is Concord, and we mark the beginning of the American Revolution here. What had been occurring was a growing dissatisfaction in the United States back to their British dictators, if you could say it that way. So just take us back a step, and there are two revolutions in American history. They don't, let me get my, they don't take us over the whole of this period. This is American Civil War. This is the American Revolution. Combine the two and you have our line of revolutions. 2020 marks the Battle of Lexington and Concord in the beginning of the American Revolution. There had been discontent growing before, but what happens at the Battle of Concord and Lexington? There is a shot fired. It's called the shot that was heard around the world. And there had been other shots fired, but this wasn't just one shot that came suddenly. There were other shots that had been fired previously. There was these other issues, other closures, but something happened in this battle that was particularly severe, that particularly shocks the people to where they were now ready to unite and conquer and fight against the British. I want to suggest that we have already seen that external waymark in our own history. It's May 25. What happened May 25? That was heard worldwide, that united a group of people already dissatisfied, who had already heard other shots fired, who are now ready to fight against the dictatorship. So the death of George Floyd, whose words, "I can't breathe," they went worldwide. It was a shot heard around the world. The impeachment of Donald Trump did not even unify the Democrats, let alone go worldwide. A few people in other cities held up protest signs saying, "Impeach the president." Even the Democrats themselves were split about whether or not to impeach him. They voted to impeach him once it came to that, but this was not the unifying force that this waymark described to us in 2018. What was described to us in 2018 was that something would happen that would unify a group of people into a movement to fight against Donald Trump. After all, the things that had been said and done over the last 3.5 years of his presidency, this was the event that unified worldwide against him. I want to suggest that conquered externally, conquered meaning to unite, is May 25. If that's external, what should we begin to expect in turn? We're reaching to the end of that 40-day period. We're reaching to the end of the wilderness experience. And that comes with implications. So I want to go back to that wilderness experience and make sure we all fully understand what that is on a reform line and what that is in application. So before going into the subject and discussion of that wilderness time period of the two 40-day histories, I want to speak about another subject that I've been facing a lot of questions about in the last month, particularly from around the time the school in Uganda. So Elder Parmender taught some things in that school. And everything I say, I agree fully with what he taught. Please don't think there's an error between Parmender and myself. This is a test. I'm describing it another way how I view that subject of what he taught, and what he taught is good advice. I have questions frequently about this from people, and it's phrased in such a way as I want to do this thing and I'm not allowed to do it? Or is that just good advice and I can if I want to? So that becomes a way many questions are phrased at this point in time since those studies were done. And like the subject of liberalism, conservatism, freedom, and religious liberty, those arguments get not maliciously, maliciously, but in whatever way they get twisted. So I want to discuss good advice. This is the way good advice works. I want people to take themselves out of their own shoes. Now you're not a member of this movement. Now you're a U.S. Navy SEAL. So you're a U.S. Navy SEAL. You have a commander up above you. You have a lieutenant tasked with organizing. You're about to go on a mission. You're told before this mission begins how many of you are going to make it through. You're a Navy SEAL. You're going on a mission. How many are going to survive? About 1 in 6. I have 30 on the board. About 1 in 6 of you will survive this mission. You're sitting with your comrades, the men that you are trained with this whole time. You look around the room. You know that 1 in 6 of you are going to make it, but 5 in your row of seating are going to die on that battlefield. The lieutenant says, hang on. The lieutenant says the commander gave you some good advice. Do you think you would take the good advice? Do you think you would stop to question it? When you go into that battle, would you say that that's his opinion? I don't need his experience. I don't need his good advice. This is the way people are using good advice in this movement. In the movement. The commander is God. He sees all. He knows all. We can't get wiser. The commander is God. He tells the lieutenant, I've given good advice to these people. I know it's good advice because I'm God. Tell them to follow this good advice when they're going into this battle. You know, 5 out of 6 of those people of your comrades are going to die. You're going to take the good advice. Yes? The only reason you would not take the good advice is if you believe it is in fact bad advice. So I want to deal with that first directly. It's a straw man's argument to say it's good advice, but I don't need to take it. Because what people are doing is not just saying it's good advice for others, but it's not good advice for me. What they are doing is saying it's not good advice for me. It isn't to you either, or for you also. What she's doing, following good advice. If they generally believed it was good advice and they knew that there was a 5 out of 6 chance the person sitting next to them was going to die on that battlefield, they would turn to them and say, I might not follow it, but I sure hope that you do. The only reason you wouldn't support your comrades in following that good advice is if you believed in your heart it was not good advice. So we need to stop using good advice as an excuse. Just be open about it. Say this is not good advice, this is bad advice. So if we generally believe this is good advice and we realize that who gave us this good advice was not mortal, but God. When we realize and we look at Millerite history, at every history, at the stone cut out of the mountain, at the portion of the crowd that began pathway at the people that drop off every time that pathway gets harder, we would not handle good advice lightly. We would see the need to take it ourselves, and even if we decide that we didn't want to follow God's good advice, we would believe it was good advice, we would not turn to our comrades on the likelihood that they are not going to survive the great controversy, final conflict, and encourage them to do their own thing, their own way, and go against the good advice. So when someone asks me, must I obey, or is it that just good advice and I can do what I want? My response to that is it's good advice, but it's life and death. We need to treat good advice as life and death. If you're on a battlefield where there's 5 out of 6 chances you're going to die, then you let's see, then you know that every good advice from your commander who trained you is life and death. I hope one feels that they I hope one I hope one feels that that parable is over dramatizing what this movement is in danger of. I'm being more than generous to suggest that 1 out of 6 people who start this journey make it. I'm being more than generous to suggest that this is just an immortal death. But beyond that, what is the Navy SEAL fighting for? For their own freedom, for their own protection. If they don't make it, the enemy wins. If the enemy takes one of them down and blunts that attack, who suffers? The people that they are designed to protect. Not designed, but yeah. The priests come with a job description, go to the church and to the world. Our families impact them. Our failures impact them. Everything starts to run together again. When we fail, people are lost because of us. Not only does our example, okay. When we fail, people are lost because of us. Not only does our example, how we behave, how we treat good advice impacts our own chance of salvation. It impacts those around us that we influence, our colleagues, and it has a flow-on effect to the people that we could have saved but won't because we left this movement over good advice. The lieutenant, what's his position? He's just stuck in the middle. Can he stand in front of them and say, the commander told me to give you this good advice, but I think you should do what you want? No. He has to say, the commander told me to. The commander is God. The lieutenant is the organization, the leaders of this movement. There is a vast degree of difference between God and between the leaders of this movement, but we are still stuck in the middle. We're still trapped saying the commander said, if you don't want to do it, that's your choice, but it's life and death. We can say that when people will at least admit that it's good advice, but people are not going to do that. We're not going that far. Sister Rockwell said, not 1 in 20, as I have said when I say 1 in 6, I'm being very generous. We don't realize the danger of the battle we are in and the lives that are lost because of us. So good advice is life and death. But at the very least, what we are asked to sign up to when we join this movement is at the very least that advice is good. And what people are doing when they use the argument of good advice is to suggest that it is not actually good advice at all, that it came from the commander as bad advice. So what are people's arguments against the vows of reform? Because that argument cannot be good advice. The arguments usually used to undermine those vows are the following. Dispensationalism. That becomes an easy word to throw out It becomes a major topic of this movement because of what occurred last year when it came to equality, racial equality and gender equality, nationalism and sexism. The concept of freedom, the concept of literal to spiritual, and this is what it means to be a liberal. So I want to deal with some of these vows, and I want to deal with them as they should have been from the very beginning with appropriate methodology. So what are these vows? We have vows that relate to adornment and jewelry, the vows that relate to diet, vows that relate to entertainment. We also have a vow that relates to the Sabbath. I'm going to put that one in as well. I want us to start looking at a couple of these subjects with appropriate methodology. But before doing that, I want to remind us how this movement began. 1989, the arrival of the first angel in human form for us, Elder Jeff Pippinger. How conservative is he? He's very conservative, both socially and morally conservative. So why would God choose a conservative? If the point that we are brought to this, if the point that we are brought to is a point of freedom and liberalism, why does God always choose for conservatives? Why Elder Jeff? I'm going to remind us of the line that we drew for equality. He has to deal gently with his church. No, that was not gentle for a liberal. It's gentle for a conservative, with as many of liberal people who would have found Elder Jeff incredibly harsh. Why not deal gently with the liberals and hard with the conservatives at the beginning? Because we wouldn't have joined a liberal movement. Liberals could not have joined a liberal movement from the beginning. You could have had someone like Ida Myers. By the way, Ida Myers is not the latter rain for the Levites. I just wanted to put that out there. I won't go into proving it, but he is bad news. I don't know who that is.
Ivor Myers.
Who?
Ivor Myers,
Oh, okay.
down in Southern California.
All right. I probably spelled wrong, right?
Yeah, it's Ivor. Yeah,
Okay.
just so anybody
That's
didn't
how
know
that.
what we're talking about. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We could have had a liberal at the very beginning, and he could have formed a liberal movement because he's dealing with a conservative church. He's dealing with a church that is split. I want to tell you why he had to choose a conservative. How do conservatives study the Bible? And Ellen White. Conservatives believe in the spirit of prophecy. That's why he had to choose a conservative, because even though they might misread the words, they believe in the words that they read. Why does a liberal do? What does a liberal do to the spirit of prophecy? So when you have the subject of trousers, when a conservative reads that, what do? Literal to literal. No proper methodology. They read the words, they believe them, and they apply them. Can God work with that? Yes. He can show them how they're reading those words incorrectly. He can show them that they need to read about dress reform and trousers in a correct fashion, following systematic rules and methodology. When a liberal reads Ellen White and she says we cannot wear trousers, what does a liberal do to that? Why do liberals wear trousers? It's not because they understand methodology. They do not. They do not. It's because they simply do not care. Can God work with someone who doesn't care? No. God cannot work with those who are willing to ignore inspiration and instructions. He can't work with those who are willing to ignore good advice and call it bad advice. He's trapped working with the conservatives because even though they can read incorrectly, they still read and they still believe that those words are the inspired words of God. A liberal who does not read at all, a liberal who does not believe the inspired word of God, a liberal who believes that they can do what is right in their own eyes, God could not work with them and cannot work with them now. The line of equality, it takes us from Eden where there is perfect equality. There is a curse. And what comes in? Suffering. What does God have to do? What does God have to do to take us back to Eden? Eden to Eden. Equality is a removing of this curse. I wanted to move from that subject of equality and turn this into the diet. Same line. Now, I want to discuss veganism. This is one of the vows. It's one of the moral reforms. Make it into a line and what happened. This was taught in Uganda and is being taught since. All right. So many of you may be familiar with it. How did our diet begin? Vegan. And then what happened? Ellen White says that meat eating was a curse, and what came in was an incredible amount of suffering. What has to happen now? That curse has to be removed before the new earth or before or after. It's got to be removed before. So you have this removal of suffering now. It's not about nationality. It's not about sexism. Now it's about the animal life we were designed to rule and protect and care for. Now that suffering must be removed because God's people cannot participate in it. And in the final generation, what are they expected to be? Vegan. So when a conservative is vegan, why are they vegan? Because they read the words. They read them literally. Ellen White says, don't they say we won't when a liberal is not a vegan? Oh man. They read them literally. Ellen White says, don't they say we won't when a liberal is not vegan? Why are they not vegan? They have all the words. It is because they're applying some type of methodology we don't know about. It's because they don't fundamentally care what God has said. That's the issue with liberalism. Excuse me. It's the fact that they will do what is right in their own eyes. So conservatives, however often they may misread, not always somehow, that the reason that they're not vegan is because they fundamentally do not care. Did it somehow go from literal veganism to spiritual veganism? Let me remind you, Ellen White is here. You had only about 150 years. You've had thousands of years between the garden and Ellen White. And did the diet somehow go from literal to spiritual in those 4,000 years or 5,000 years? And then between Ellen White, it went from liberal to spiritual. Equality, men and women, was it true here, literal? Introduction of patriarchal leadership that somehow turned into spiritual over here? No, it's sexism here, sexism here. Patriarchy here, veganism here, and veganism here. Now that diet looks like on a plate we may have different food. What that diet looks like on a plate, we may have different foods. Depends on what country you're from. Depends what has been grown through that time period. The way that patriotic might look is different from country to country. It may look slightly different to what it did back then, but the system, the message has not gone from literal to spiritual. It has been an eternal principle. So that's just one reform line, Val, that you can put a line and see where the studies and liberals come to different understanding and why. God can work with a conservative that he can teach and how to read properly. God could never work with a liberal who simply doesn't care what the words say. Ooh. I guess that's it.
Nice review. That was the one that was from Canada, right?
Yes.
That's what I thought. Yeah, because then I know where to put it on the website. Because I think I did a few of those, and then
Yeah, you did the ones before it.
yeah, and I want to
We
say
traded, yeah.
Sue Ellen. Her and her husband did those first 4.
Right.
The Vision of the Path. Yeah. Yeah, I really liked all those studies. Thank you, Robert.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody, for putting up with my reading.
You did great.
Good study, Robert.
Thank you.
I love the pictures you put in there.
Yeah, you're come a long ways from everything you're learning to do.
Yeah, you've learned a lot. You're doing great.
Very creative.
Well, I got more time now, so I started this afternoon one on Luxembourg. You know, the things you're doing on the Saturday afternoon.
Sweet. Nice.
Well, if you guys want, we're done a little bit early. We can dig back into the evangelicals.
Yeah.
Let me
Sounds
pull
great
it up.
to me.
And I think we're still in chapter 5. And I hope
I've got that we're at the bottom of page 151.
the bottom of page 151.
Last paragraph.
Is that where you marked it? Okay.
That's what I wrote.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I guess I did mark it. You marked it. Because it is chapter 5, the separatists. But let me pull it up on share screen.
So we're in chapter 5 now?
Yeah, we've been in chapter 5 for a while. The
Oh.
separatists.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then next is the Billy Graham one. So this is 151 right here. And we were reading about Norris. He came up on the Sabbath. Somebody brought up Norris. We're seeing that there's a division even though there's this division between conservatives and liberals, the old school, new school, the modernists, the fundamentalists. Within the fundamentalists, there are also divisions. And so that's what we've been kind of seeing in here. So trying to think back to make sure that we don't miss anything. I'm gonna pull it back here just a little bit. So when not otherwise occupied, Norris battled the forces of evil in politics. In the 1970s, he railed against Texas judges he deemed lax in enforcing prohibition. He urged Fort Worth citizens to oust all Catholics from the city government. And before the 1928 presidential election, he campaigned tirelessly against Al Smith, the first Catholic to run for president. Thereafter, his politics became less than consistent. At first, yeah, this is where we see that he flip-flops. At first, he supported the New Deal on the grounds that it would avert revolution. Then he turned against it on the grounds that it was the communist revolution. He never engaged in anti-Semitism, but he praised the Nazi regime for saving Germany from communism until 1938, when, remembering his premillennial Zionism, he condemned Hitler for persecuting the Jews. He opposed US involvement in Europe until 1940. Then, in another about-face, he preached revivals to rally support for intervention and praised President Roosevelt. In a post-war crusade against communism, he allied himself with his former enemy, the Catholic hierarchy, and discovered Red Fifth and discovered Red Fifth columnists in the leadership of the Southern Baptist Convention. Yeah, I'm glad we reviewed this little piece because that's what we were discussing where we left off. We see that he flip-flops a lot, but now he's allied himself with the enemy, which we see this is our second history of allying with the enemy to reach their greater goals. All the while, his celebrity grew and his empire expanded. A part of his charm, it seems, was that he was always raising Cain, and no one knew what he might do next. In 1935, he took on a second church, Temple Baptist, in Detroit. In detaching it from the Northern Baptist Convention, he created a huge congregation of rural, white Southerners who had come to work in the auto factories. In Detroit and Fort Worth, he broadcast his sermons on the radio, and by 1946, his two churches had a combined membership of 25,000, the largest congregation he boasted under the leadership of a single pastor. In addition, he created satellite churches by gathering converts from his revivals and sending them his Bible school graduates as pastors. By the time the war broke out, he had led these newly formed churches and a number of others into an organization called the Pre-Millennial Baptist Missionary Fellowship, later the World Baptist Fellowship. In the 1940s, Norris consorted with many powerful people, among them Detroit automobile executives and leading Texas politicians, such as Tom Connolly and Sam Rayburn. The Texas state legislature invited him to speak on several occasions and once honored him for his work in rooting out communists. Just before the war, he traveled to England with the blessings of Roosevelt administration officials and met with Winston Churchill. Later, he gained an audience with Pope Pius XII. Political power clearly appealed to him. During the 1948 campaign, he corresponded with both Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey, assuring both of them that they would win. I'm taking it maybe somebody knows Thomas Dewey was running against Harry Truman. I never heard the name Thomas Dewey. The only people Norris seemed unable to deal with were his fellow Protestant ministers. The Southern Baptist congregation, is it Congregation Church, the Southern Baptist leaders were his natural enemies, and throughout his life, he continued to accuse them of everything short of Satanism. But he also broke with allies, such as William B. Riley, and he attacked his own proteges, often in ways calculated to cause them public humiliation. Unable to tolerate even a hint of independence or the possibility of competition, he reserved the worst punishments for those he chose to succeed him in one or another of his ministries. He'd appoint loyal pastors, then rescind the offers, or he'd countermand their decisions, or he'd play a practical joke. He cut one of them off in the midst of a radio broadcast and laughed while the minister preached to himself in the glass booth of the sound studio. Not everyone understood his humor, but all of them had fair warning. Asked by an acolyte late in his life what he would do differently if he had the chance, he said, "I would never have a Sunday school. I would have a pig-tight organization. I would build it all around J. Frank Norris." Naturally, there were defections, among them of his unfortunate son, who had followed him in the ministry. In 1950, 2 years before his death, one of his most trusted lieutenants, G. Beauchamp Vic, righteously decamped with a follow the schism in the World Baptist Fellowship. So I asked if anybody remembered. I'm pretty sure this is the same guy. You guys can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you okay.
Okay. I just have a thing if they're saying my internet was unstable. About J. Frank Norris, that I'm pretty sure he's the one that has the son that speaks about speaks out about his father against what his father did. I just can't remember the name to look him up. And I tried looking up J. Frank Norris and then Google his son, and I just couldn't find the name, couldn't remember who he was. But I know I've seen people post videos, and I was just trying to go back and remember what he was about. I mean, who it is that wants to follow him. I don't know if it's the liberals in the Adventist church that want to follow him. I just kind of couldn't remember. And I don't know if anybody looked him up or tried to remember who he or did remember who he was, but I'm pretty sure it's the same person. But totally spoke out against what his dad did. Norris's empire split apart, but after his death, his brand of fundamentalism continued to spread through the South and Southwest at a greater pace than before. He had left two strong institutions, his Fort Worth Church and his seminary, and under new leaders, his World Baptist Fellowship grew apace. Then two of the proteges he had alienated proved even more successful institution builders than he. John R. Rice, an evangelist who had started half a dozen fundamentalist Baptist churches in the Dallas area before he broke with Norris, founded a newspaper, The Sword of the Lord, that by 1956 had a circulation of over 100,000 and had become an important fundamentalist periodical. His books sold millions of copies, and his conferences attracted thousands of pastors each year. He also helped organize the Southwide Baptist Fellowship, an organization that by the early 1970s had a membership of 2,000 pastors. Beauchamp Vic, for his part, took over the Temple Baptist Church in Detroit, and with his supporters established the Baptist Bible Fellowship and College in Springfield, Missouri. The Baptist Bible Fellowship, which in the 1950s and 60s focused on church planting, became the most successful of all the separatist networks. By the 1970s, the college was the largest Bible school in the country. And by the early 1980s, the fellowship had nearly 3,000 churches and well over 1 million members, one of whom was Jerry Falwell. Presbyterian fundamentalists, unlike their Baptist counterparts, tended to stay within their denomination. But in the 1930s, there was one significant defection, that of J. Gresham Machen. The group he led out of the church was small, but it proved important to both wings of the fundamentalist movement in the 1950s. Machen, who had quit the Princeton Theological Seminary with a group of faculty and students in 1929, had established a new seminary, Westminster, in Philadelphia. His ambition was to make Westminster what Princeton had been, an internationally recognized center for Orthodox scholarship and the most influential seminary in the Presbyterian Church. Machen, however, could not put up with what he saw as the increasingly lax doctrinal standards in his denomination, and particularly in its Board of Foreign Missions. At the 1933 General Assembly, he launched a full-scale attack on the board. When rebuffed, he and colleagues announced the formation of an independent Board of Foreign Missions, explicitly designed to deflect funds from the denominational board. The Assembly reacted just as the National Baptist Convention had in a similar circumstance. It declared the new board unconstitutional and directed all Presbyterians to sever their connections with it or face disciplinary action. Machen refused to recognize the Assembly's decision and declared his denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, an apostate church. The 1936 Assembly expelled him and 8 of his colleagues, and a few months later, he and others formed a new denomination, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. The new church was not a success in the first place. Few Presbyterians followed him out of the denomination to join it. Even his friend Clarence McCartney, who had led the fundamentalist rebellion with him, thought better of splitting the denomination and resigned from the board of the Westminster Seminary with 12 other trustees. Then the tiny new church divided into 2 factions. On the one hand, the old school Calvinists, led by Machen, and on the other hand, the evangelical fundamentalists, led by Oliver Buswell, the president of Wheaton College, and Carl McIntyre, the young pastor of a large New Jersey church. So there's a split here within. You have the old school Calvinists and the evangelical fundamentalists. So if I understand correctly, they're all fundamentalists or evangelicals. They're all just different titles, but within them they're split. Within this old school, they're split. So the dispute between the two factions began when McIntyre criticized the Westminster Seminary for not requiring its students and faculty to forswear the use of alcohol. McIntyre, who had been a student at Princeton and had followed Machen to Westminster, knew full well that the strict Calvinists regarded the prohibition of alcohol as extra-biblical and an infringement on their Christian liberty. However, he and Buswell hoped to build a separatist movement on a broader base than that of confessional Calvinism, and McIntyre meant to lead it. He had been a founding member of the Independent Board of Foreign Missions and one of those defrocked with Machen. And earlier that year, he had established a new fundamentalist weekly, the Christian Beacon. The conflict soon expanded to a dispute over dispensationalism, and a power struggle ensued. McIntyre and his allies wrested control of the Independent Missions Board from Machen, but finding themselves in the minority in the new church, they left it and founded their own church and seminary. In the midst of this conflict, Machen, then only 55, died suddenly on New Year's Day, 1937, engaged in what he must have seen as the dispiriting task of fundraising in North Dakota. In the 1930s and 40s, most liberal intellectuals continued to cling to the notion conceived during the Scopes trial that fundamentalism was a largely rural phenomenon. In fact, by then it had developed a rural component thanks to men like Riley and Norris. Still, the major fundamentalist institutions, the big churches, the Bible schools, and seminaries were in the cities. Fundamentalism attracted a great variety of people, but by all evidence, its main constituency was small town Protestants who had come to the cities to work in the factories and mills. Noticeably, there were high concentrations of fundamentalist churches or gospel tabernacles in the fast-growing cities like Detroit, where the auto industry took off in the 1920s, and Los Angeles, where military bases, oil refineries, and defense industries proliferated during and after World War II. There was a logic to this, as Nancy Ammerman, a scholar of the movement, puts it. Fundamentalism is most likely to be found at the points where tradition is meeting modernity, rather than where modernity, that's a hard word to say, is most remote. In the late 19th century, fundamentalism had developed along similar points of conflict. Dwight Moody's audiences had been largely made up of recent migrants from the countryside, yet making the transition from rural to city life was, generally speaking, a great deal more wrenching in the second quarter of the 20th century than it had been in Moody's day. After World War I, the cities lost much of the Victorian Protestant culture that had grown up in small town America, and that survived in many regions of the country. Educated people often made the transition from country to city without much stress. But for the less educated, Marsden writes, the journey often entailed a traumatic cultural upheaval analogs to that experienced by immigrants from abroad. Those who retained the worldview of Victorian Protestantism found themselves in a pluralistic society where their beliefs were considered outdated or even bizarre. Fundamentalism appealed to uprooted rural Americans as it did to Protestants who had fairly recently immigrated from the country countryside of Northern Europe. In reaction to the strange new environment of the cities, fundamentalists formed the equivalent of urban ghettos, church communities in which they could separate themselves from what they considered the corruption of the world. They couldn't, of course, separate themselves entirely, but they typically spent many of their non-working hours in church or church-related activities and held to such traditional evangelical behavioral standards as abstinence from alcohol, card playing, social dancing, and theater going. Bible studies were stressed, and the zealous interpolated their conversation with biblical phrases and etched Bible verses onto jackknife handles, automobile spare tire covers, and plaques for the walls of their homes. Such practices served as boundary markers between the Lord's people and the apostate others. A moviegoer, for example, was not a consecrated Christian, no matter what other Christian virtues he seemed to possess. Fundamentalist churches offered shelter from modernist ideas and worldliness, but fundamentalists, unlike Amish farmers, were not separatists who simply wanted to preserve their own ways, but the Lord's army contending for the faith once delivered. They were, as they saw it, the saving remnant and the rightful heirs to American civilization. Whether they figured themselves as martyrs or as potential conquerors, militancy became important to their sense of identity. Their preachers kept up their diatribes against modernism long after the liberals had stopped listening to them and fought each other over tiny doctrinal differences. As the historian Joel Carpenter writes, rhetorical aggressiveness and machismo became a part of their mystique, and military metaphors abounded. Sunday sermons denouncing theological errors or the sins of the flesh raised the barriers around their flocks, and as Norris clearly understood, served as a form of entertainment for the righteous. In any case, the fundamentalist warlords kept discovering new enemies, and whether they picked up on such commonly held prejudices as anti-Catholicism or anti-Semitism, or attacked the New Deal, the new enemy was always the worst threat to Christianity ever known. For fundamentalists, the world was always in a state of crisis, with Satan ever appearing in new guises. It was a former believer wrote, virtually impossible to grow up in a fundamentalist church in the second quarter of the 20th century, or to be a member of such a church, whatever one's age, without seeing not only the church, but all of life in the what is that word? Manichean terms? Does anybody know what that word is? Or I can look it up, right? I can click on it. Is that how you do that? I didn't get it.
Yeah, so select it, like double click on the word and then right click on it. Double click on it to select it. Yep, just the one, yeah. Oops, maybe single click. Left click. Yeah, there. Try that.
I double clicked and it took the whole thing. It took the whole,
Yeah.
this one?
Right click on it.
I just,
There, it was on there. Okay, now right click. See, there's a search the web for men. Yeah.
got it, okay. That doesn't help me. An adherent of,
It totally doesn't help. Which is
that doesn't
which
help.
is the check that one, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Adherent to a dualistic religious system of mains, a combination of Gnostic Christianity, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and various other elements. The basic doctrine of conflict between light and dark, matter being regarded as dark and evil.
so
read that.
yin and yang, black and white, dark, light and dark kind of thing.
Yeah, so
Good and evil.
For fundamentalists, the world was always in a state of crisis. with Satan ever appearing in new guises. It was a former believer wrote, virtually impossible to grow up in a fundamentalist church in the second quarter of the 20th century, or to be a member of such a church, whatever one's age, without seeing not only the church, but all of life in Menashian terms. So if I kind of understood that, it's like a mixture of a whole lot of things, and it's possible to not to see all that mixture.
Yeah, I have a definition relating to dualism or
Okay.
conflict between opposites. Dualistic.
Hmm.
That's what it means.
So would that like amount to like confusion in the church?
There's two sides,
Yeah, okay. Do you want to read, Sister Jackie?
two views.
Yeah, within the church. And
Yeah.
from what they're saying, it was impossible to be in there at that time to not see it. Do you want to read, or does somebody else want to read?
Sure, I can read. Okay, where'd we stop? Whether
Yeah.
they stayed in their denominations or not, fundamentalists became increasingly isolated from their fellow Protestants and the rest of the country. Some found this a secure and happy state, and fighting the good fight a fulfilling task. Others, however, began to feel uncomfortable with the endless controversies and painfully aware of their second-class status in the Protestant world. The solution they envisioned was not compromise, but a national revival that would restore conservative Protestantism to its former preeminence, or, as they saw it, to bring America back to Christianity. The division between the two groups manifested itself in the early 1940s with the formation of two new organizations, both of them led by former students of J. Gresham Machen.
Some of that reminds me of what we see in that description reminds me of what we see in the Adventist church. And tell me if I'm understanding it right. Because there's all kinds of, Adventism should have been Adventism. Instead, Adventism is got, there's all these different flavors in religion, but within each religion, you have all these different flavors. Everybody choosing, I guess it's the book of Judges, everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes, right?
Yeah.
And so you've got all these different understandings and beliefs going on.
Yeah, quite a mixture of ideology and within.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in 1941, just 3 years after splitting from Manchin's church, McIntyre made his bid for the leadership of the fundamentalist movement, bringing together two tiny Presbyterian groups, his own and another. He founded what he grandly called the American Council of Christian Churches, declaring war on the Federal Council of Churches. He invited all those churches that had left their apostate denominations to join in creating a 20th century Reformation. That's footnoted.
It's interesting because it's like all these different this is going on, and you until you're united, you're kind of without power.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's no union, which, when you compare and contrast that, you look at what the Lord is doing in bringing unity through the truth. There's power. We can see the power. We can
Exactly.
we can see that there's power in this message. And so they lack power because they have no unity, but they must get to the point where they start bringing some unity to some of their stuff, to where they lead up to Jerry Falwell. But this is still pre-Billy Graham.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we can compare with Republicans and Democrats.
Right.
you know?
But even within the
In their
Republican,
within their own ranks, you know, they're divided. So at the same time, an old friend of his, Harold Kenya, was in the process of mounting an organization to unite conservative Protestants. And McIntyre's announcement caused him some concern. Okenga was another member of a close-knit group of students who had left Princeton for Westminster with Machen, but his career had taken a different turn. On graduating, he had served as an assistant pastor in Clarence Macartney's church. And when the conflict erupted over the Independent Mission Board, he had sided with McCartney and remained within the denomination. In 1936, after earning a doctorate in philosophy, he took the pulpit of one of the cathedrals of fundamentalism, the Park Street Church on Boston Common, and became widely known for the eloquence of his preaching and the vigor of his leadership. A lay evangelist who belonged to his church, J. Elwyn Wright, had several years earlier created the New England Fellowship, an association of churches that put on evangelistic campaigns, conferences, and summer camps, and Bible study programs across the region. Wright's organization was unique in the country in that it included a variety of conservative churches, separatists, fundamentalists, Pentecostal, ethnic, and mainline. In 1939, he had begun to explore the possibility of creating a national association of a similar kind. The project appealed to Okenga, and by 1941, the two had talked with ministers across the country and were planning to call an inaugural meeting the following year, but McIntyre had upstaged them. Initially, Wright and Okenga hoped the two groups might cooperate, but they soon realized that cooperation was the last thing McIntyre had in mind. A grandstander who never spoke of his projects in less than cosmic terms, McIntyre envisioned a revolutionary realignment of American Protestantism. A revolutionary realignment of American Protestantism, but he would allow only separatists to join his American Council of Christian Churches. And he vilified those fundamentalists, such as Okenga, who stayed within their denomination. Clearly would never join an organization that he didn't control. And he was far more concerned with attacking the Federal Council of Churches than with promoting a national revival. Wright and Okenga therefore decided to go ahead with their own plans. In 1942, Wright and Okenga convened a conference in St. Louis and launched the National Association of Evangelicals. For them and their fellow organizers, the purpose of the association was to bring together a wide range of evangelical groups into a united front that could represent evangelical issues to the government, act as a national clearinghouse for evangelical programs, and foster the cooperation among churches that would permit community-wide revivals. Their fervent hope was to stir a great awakening across the land. In their view, the NAE would have to steer a course between the shoals of modernism and the rocks of the negative. Contentious fundamentalism that had led to fragmenting of the church. At the conference, Kenga, a tall, I have to raise that up. Thank you. Imperious figure delivered a spirited address. America, he said, was in peril because Christianity was disintegrating. Evangelicals had suffered nothing but a series of defeats for decades because of the terrible octopus of liberalism. Same old story.
Yeah.
This is what they go to. They suffered nothing. I'm just going to read that because it's not only from the past, but it's reoccurring in our time. Evangelicals had suffered nothing but a series of defeats for decades because of the terrible octopus of liberalism. So they're blaming that. The position or the poison of materialism and floods of iniquity. Yet when things looked the darkest, God would use his faithful remnant to bring a revival. Oh, wow. Faithful remnant. Evangelicals, he said, were scattered and needed to organize for a new era in evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, and when you look at what they're doing in Texas and Georgia and different places when it comes to voting, there was a big thing today that they just, it was an article.
Absolutely.
Teacher chat. And you know, it's just amazing that the tactics that they use and get away with for winning, and people think it's all right. And then you've got Flynn, a high-ranking general in the military, had been going out and espousing QAnon theories. It makes you think about the people that are in charge of this country, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking about this division and all this division within them. I mean, it's a failed history.
Yeah.
They're not together, so it's a failed history. And I don't know if that's the case. Maybe somebody remembers, but I don't know if specifically. I would think it had to do with it, but I can't remember all the details of the things we've read. But in the first history, were they dealing with all these divisions? Because they're definitely dealing with all these divisions. And we know that Adventism deals with all these divisions, right? We know the Catholic Church deals with all these divisions. And now here we are in the third history, the history of success, and God is preparing a people where there's going to be no division. And so you're going to have these different entities as well be united, and united by deception as well, because we read that in some of the A.T. Jones articles, and I still always struggle to remember the exact words that he used, but it's through deception that these people are going to be led to support the enactment of the decree that they're going to enact.
Yeah, it's already being set up.
Yeah. So
it's not only the counterfeit, but those that will fall for the counterfeit.
Right. And it's counterfeit liberalism. And I'm always, I don't know, amazed is right. I don't know, I'm always stunned at my own self with stuff that I don't get, because you know, what we were reading and going through, trying to sort out last week in this book here, in some of the other articles that we were reading, it's like they unite, or we see that, you know, I was looking at it, we were having our discussion, I was looking at it, it's like, well, wait a second, because okay, the Pope is liberal, so does the liberals join up with them? And then Brother Fell brought up a couple of points. We wound up back in the American papacy, and then we're reading the notes on Sabbath, and there it is right there. Elder Tess had already said it. So that the conservatives are united even though it's their enemy, they're united on this issue. So it's going to be a trap for the liberals to go. I would think be a trap for the liberals to go and choose the Catholic Church, believing that they're liberal and they're not.
Yeah, it'll be very convincing though.
Yeah,
They will. Yeah, for those who want to follow a lie, they're gonna follow it, no matter what. I mean, they don't realize it's a lie, but you know, it's so convincing though.
but we surely need the right understanding of equality, the right understanding of this message, if we're to be of any help to any of them
Mm-hmm.
to see. We have to be living it, practicing it, and take the persecution for practicing it. Because imagine the response of Adventism when they come to see that we support gay marriage and the LGBT, right? Imagine the persecution and the trying to think of the word that, you know, the attacks and such like that, of how wrong they're going to try to say that we are. So we have to be strong to help those that will hear. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. But
the other thing I got out of that study on Sabbath is that the Levites have to already have an understanding of these histories, and of not of these histories. The Levites have to already have an understanding of the three movements: the civil rights, the second wave feminism, and then Stonewall and the they have to have an understanding of those issues, and that's all preparing them to then hear. And yes, they have a "thus saith the Lord," and they'll use it. And then
yeah, it'll fit perfectly for their ideology because they're conservative, more morally conservative.
Yeah.
In their thinking.
Yeah.
And of course, the "thus saith the Lord" backs it up.
Right.
So they'll be deceived.
Right.
They won't even be looking for the equality problem. It's yeah, it's really a very, very clever counterfeit for Satan to use to deceive a lot of people. And even we within the message could be deceived as well.
Yeah, we don't have a right understanding of things, a right understanding and use of the methodology, and a right understanding of equality based on the methodology, based on line upon line use of parables. We don't have that right understanding.
Yeah, exactly. That's a key factor.
Yeah.
In the understanding of how to read God's word.
Right.
And you know, it'll be such proof to the moral thinking people that this is God's word. We would never go against it. I'm standing strong for this. He says this is wrong.
Yeah.
And to be, it's, yeah, it is quite a serious thing that's coming. I mean, and it's already in the process of being developed in people.
It's ready to come to a head.
So, did you want me to read a little bit more here? We've got, or unless someone else would like to read.
Somebody else like to read? I'll go ahead then.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and finish it up. Or not, they're just finished up tonight. The following year, 600 people from nearly 50 denominations turned up at a constitutional convention in Chicago and formally inaugurated the NAE. What was the NAE? North American Evangelicals? Is that right? Formally inaugurated, and I think that's what it was. Still, the sizable coalition the founders had hoped for did not emerge. The largest denominations, such as the Southern Baptist Convention. So I mean, this is the religious side, not the political side, but they're so mingled. But they're just not big enough. I'm just thinking about what they're doing with all the voting and stuff and how they've progressed. So they're not big enough to accomplish what they want. And look at what they do to the voting to get people in office that'll help them get what they want. It's really sad. So still the sizable coalition the founders had hoped for did not emerge. The largest denominations, such as the Southern Baptist Convention and Missouri Synod Lutheran, decided that their own organizations were quite sufficient. A number of other important groups backed off because of McIntyre. The New Jersey pastor who had caused a commotion at the first meeting attacked the NAE for failing to take a definite stand against the Federal Council of Churches. And when the NAE leaders were goaded into a counterattack, he accused them of battling true Christians rather than the FCC and the enemies of the Lord. With that, the heads of some of the major fundamentalist institutions, such as the Moody Bible Institute and Wheaton College, sidled away from the NAE for fear of alienating their separatist constituencies, though Bob Jones Sr. and John Rice became members for a time. Wright, for now on the defensive, began attacking the Federal Council. And in 1944, the NAE charged its bylaws so as to bar denominations that were members of the FCC. Wright, however, soon realized that McIntyre, no stranger to what Okenga called a back alley scrap, had outmaneuvered him. The several denominations that belonged to the FCC quit the fledgling NAE, and the fundamentalist chiefs did not return. By 1948, the NAE comprised 18 small denominations, most of them Pentecostal, and its constituency, which included individual churches and individual members, amounted to just 750,000. Its founders had intended to create an organization with a positive, constructive approach. But after their attacks on the Federal Council, liberal Protestants came to see the NAE as just another sectarian enterprise, hardly distinguishable from McIntyre's group. Wright and Okenga were disappointed. Still, the NAE gradually made a place for itself on the national scene, whereas the American Council remained a tiny organization, little more than a platform for McIntyre's tirade against the FCC. The NAE doubled in size during the 1950s and spun off a number of special purpose groups, such as the National Religious Broadcasters Mission Society and an organization of conservative theologians. With an office in Washington, it worked on practical issues like promoting military chaplains, I guess that's what it is, promoting military chaplains, thus demonstrating that conservative Protestant churches could work together for certain specific ends. By 1960s, it was still a small organization, almost invisible to mainline Protestants. But by its very existence, it opened up a fault line between militant separatists and the evangelical fundamentalists who led it. It's interesting too, when you think about Jesus as the shepherd and how the shepherd has to bring all the sheep together. And you look at this side of things and Satan wanting to be a shepherd, so to speak, right? Trying to bring all his people to all his sheep together for his great work, and he can't get them together. And
Interesting.
and
Yeah, they're scattered. He's trying to, yeah.
he's trying to gather them, and they're and so it's a failed history though. So the National Association of Evangelicals was so called because it included Pentecostal and other conservative denominations. But the term evangelical didn't mean very much because liberals also regarded themselves as evangelicals. Fundamentalists use the terms fundamentalist and evangelical interchangeably. Fundamentalists use the term fundamentalist and evangelical interchangeably. However, during the skirmishes with McIntyre in 1943, the editor of the NAE magazine wrote of a growing chasm between militant fundamentalists on one side And on the other, a group that he said we will designate as evangelicals for the sake of distinction. The difference was then more like a hairline fracture than a chasm. But in the following years, it widened, and Okenga and other NAE leaders took to calling themselves evangelicals in order to escape the associations of bigotry and narrowness attached to militants such as McIntyre. As a small bureaucracy atop independent denominations and churches, the NAE proved incapable of creating the revivals that Wright and Okenga longed for. Still, around the time the NAE came into being fundamentalist broadcasters, it's interesting because their goal is their own self and their own power is what it seems like. And who's going to be the next greatest revivalist? But they don't have the right purpose to what the revival is supposed to be. I don't know if I worded that to where it made sense, but they just want to be a revivalist, but they don't seem to have the right purpose to revive.
Yeah, it's all about self.
Yeah.
Selfish. Yeah.
Self-power. So still around the time the NAE came into being, fundamentalist broadcasters had begun to attract large audiences from across the spectrum of conservative Protestantism. The most important of these was Charles E. Fuller, a Californian who in the mid-1930s had developed a Sunday evening program, the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour. The program, which featured folksy preaching, gospel singing, and interaction with the audience through letters read and discussed on the air, proved so popular it was taken up by a national radio network, the Mutual Broadcasting System. By 1942, the program was carried on more than 450 stations, and though the secular media ignored it, it had the largest audience on radio, surpassing even the Bob Hope Show. Fuller had an unlikely background for a popular evangelist. Born in 1887, the son of a prosperous orange grower, he graduated from Pomona College. Is this going to be where Charles E. Fuller? Because this is down in the area where Schuller winds up being later on, right? I think he said he was in California. Yeah, California.
Schuller.
Huh?
Schuller, you said?
Yeah, Robert Schuller. He winds up in somewhere in his history, or maybe a little bit later, rising up in that area.
Southern California.
Yeah, Southern California.
Yeah.
Fuller had an unlikely background for a popular evangelist. Born in 1887, the son of a prosperous orange grower, he graduated from Pomona College, married the college-educated daughter of a physician, and had a successful career dealing in citrus fruits in Southern California real estate. At age 29, he was converted by a fundamentalist radio evangelist, and from 1919 to 1921, he studied at the Bible Institute of Los Angeles under the tutelage of its president, Reuben Torrey. Finding his calling as a preacher, he taught a Bible class at the Presbyterian Church near his home, and in 1925 led it out of the church and reorganized it as an independent fundamentalist congregation. Ordained by the Baptist Bible Union, he served as pastor of this breakaway church for the next 8 years. He became a member of the Bible Institute of Los Angeles board, and when Torrey's successor was deemed insufficiently militant, he took a leading role in replacing him. In sum, he had become an archetypal separatist. Somebody help me. Archetypical separatist. Still, Fuller deeply believed in a national revival. And after taking up a radio ministry in the early 1930s, he realized that if he was to build a sizable audience, he had to avoid the fights that racked the divided fundamentalists. There's going to be a compromiser. Accordingly, he began to downplay doctrinal differences and to make a warm, positive presentation of the gospel. He remained a premillennialist and sometimes preached dispensationalist readings of the Bible in detail, but his main message, repeated every Sunday evening, was simply that Jesus loves you and Jesus saves. The program, Marsden writes, was frankly old-fashioned, designed to evoke nostalgia for the revival style of one's youth. Fuller, in other words, had found his audience largely composed of older people by recovering the evangelical style that prevailed before the emergence of militant fundamentalism. Meanwhile, other evangelists were taking the opposite tack in organizing revivals for young people with modern and distinctly post-fundamentalist measures. The revivalists were not established figures, but young men in tune with the emerging teen culture who borrowed unashamedly from popular entertainers, Hollywood pictures, and secular radio shows. Their model was Percy Crawford, a radio evangelist famous in the 1930s for his love of sporty clothes, fast cars, and practical jokes. His program, Young People's Church of the Air, featured trumpet trios playing jazzed up gospel tunes and sermons delivered in the rapid fire manner of radio news reporters. During the war years, protege Jack Wistrin, that's a hard one to say. Ritzen, it must be a Jack Whitzen, I don't know how to say that one. So held youth rallies throughout New York City, where he preached and performed with the band. His blend of religion and entertainment proved so popular with teens and young servicemen that by 1944, he was holding rallies at Carnegie Hall in Madison Square Garden. Toward the end of the war, ministers in other cities, Washington, Detroit, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Indianapolis, and Chicago, took up the Western format and put on youth rallies, bringing in whatever talent was available, such as the sleight of hand artist, ventriloquist, and closed harmony groups. At the time, juvenile delinquency, an elastic category that stretched from gang members to bobby soxers, preoccupied respectable people across the country. And these Youth for Christ rallies held on Saturday nights attracted the support of churches and civic clubs such as Rotary and Lions. So I think we're going to have to oh no, we're finished. Oh, good. We're almost done with this section. Okay. And so next time you pick up, we'll pick up with Billy Graham. Okay. So under the leadership of Torrey Johnson, a 34-year-old Illinois pastor, Chicagoland Youth for Christ became the hub of the movement. And in 1945, Johnson incorporated it as an international organization. Well connected in Chicago and a natural impresario, Johnson put together a network of Christian businessmen and conservative churches to produce rallies with dance bands or zippy gospel singers and fiery young preachers in gaudy suits. The apotheosis of his work was a patriotic religious pageant with a choir of 5,300-piece band at Soldier Field on Memorial Day 1945. During the rally, war heroes and famous athletes attested to their faith. High school cadets performed the flag ceremony with 400 marching nurses. Evangelists spoke of a national revival, and missionaries dressed in the costumes of foreign lands dramatized their call for the complete evangelization of the world in our generation. The Youth for Christ rallies peaked in 1946 with an estimated 900 events across the nation. Their numbers declined after the servicemen went home, but in many communities, they had brought diverse conservative Protestants together. They had also created a bench of young revivalists eager to show their mettle to reach the world for Christ. One of them was Billy Graham. So Billy Graham will be where we'll be picking up when we pick this up next time. And
What was on that next page? Was it a new chapter or something?
Is Billy Graham, his next chapter.
Chapter 6?
Yeah, chapter 6. Let me pull that. Yeah, are you marking? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it was chapter 6. Oh, my chapters didn't show up here.
I guess I could have looked myself.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, it was chapter 6 though. The chapter on Billy Graham going to start. And I was going to send this to a couple of you guys this morning when I went on my walk. I have some neighbors behind me, and We see a lot of strange things, and it makes you wonder what goes on inside the minds of people. But they had the American flag flying, you know, in their on the front of their house, and then on like it was like in front of the door, and then on the other side of the house, in the front, there was another flag, and it had the stars portion of the American flag, and then the rest of the flag was white, and instead of stripes, the stripes were made of assault rifles. If you can picture that in your head, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't want to picture it.
That's just wow. I was going to send that to Larry and say, what do you make of this? I mean, sarcasm, I guess, but
Just depressing.
it's really sad. I mean, I was going to say it in a strange way, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I get what it means. It was just like, wow. And I talked to these people.
And they're nice.
Yeah, I talked to the I could tell he's sexist. He lives behind me, and a few weeks back or so, I don't know, well, a while back, a year or so ago, right when the lockdown began, I heard the sounds of all these trucks pull in, and I knew those sounds. It was a pool that was going to be built, and I thought, well, that's really odd, putting in a pool right in the middle of a lockdown, you know, and
a drought.
yeah, and it's well, somebody said, well, it's outdoors, you know, they're going to be outdoors working. It's not like they're inside. And it's like, well, that just seems really weird. So anyway, so they had this pool put in, and at one point in time, they needed to do some work on the fence, which I share part of it with. And so my neighbor next door had introduced me and asked me, you know, he said, oh, Elaine's really nice. She'll have no problem, you know, and I didn't. And they, you know, they did what they needed to do the fence. And then a few weeks ago, or I don't know, maybe it's a month or so ago, I was out in the backyard with the dogs, and I heard some kind of noise, and then they have a little dog that barks all the time when my dogs are out there. My dogs don't generally bark at that dog. But their little dog would really bark. And anyways, I heard something kind of snap, and I went and looked up at that fence, and I saw that it broke loose on the bottom, and there was this big gap. And I know they have a little dog, and plus at the time, you know, little Sheba here wasn't all that big either. She was easily going to fit through there. So, and I didn't know the guy's name, or couldn't remember his name, and hadn't talked to him, but I didn't see anybody back there. So I started to head out. I texted my neighbor and asked him, you know, if he knew if the other guy was home, and I didn't hear from my neighbor right away. So I head out to walk around the corner, and that's when my neighbor next door contacted me. So anyways, they worked together on fixing it. This is about a month ago. And I could tell though, when I was out there, you can kind of get a feel for when somebody's really sexist. They just ignore the woman in the conversation. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter that you're the woman with a home and blah, 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 you know, and you work and you do all these things. It doesn't matter. You're still a woman.
Just a woman.
So anyways, yeah, and I saw that flag, and I was like, wow. What is in the mind of people that would fly such a flag in their yard? It's worse than the one that I've seen have their Trump. They still have their Trump signs up that Trump's president, and I got somebody else across from me the other way that has a impeach Biden sign. So I think I'm surrounded by quite a few Trump supporters here in this little neighborhood.
So. Yeah, well, come to Arkansas.
Were you guys getting Kathy?
Well, I said, come on to Arkansas. You'll see all kinds of things.
Oh yeah, probably. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, I can't. I don't know if it's my internet or yours, but the sound is not good. But yeah, they're still flying I think most of the Trump ones are down. I haven't seen an impeach Biden yet, but there's